Thank you. Thank you. All right, everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Eileen Lynch. I work on programming and development here at the Hoboken Historical Museum. I want to thank you for joining us. Irene, I want to thank you for joining us today. This is the second in our lecture of our series of New Jersey Women Make History, which we've created to raise awareness and appreciation for the legacies of some of New Jersey's history-making women. The next lecture in this series is going to be Sunday, October 18th at 4 p.m. and will feature author Amy Shapiro. She'll be speaking on her book, Millicent Fenwick, Her Way. That will be in the museum as well as live streamed. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with New Jersey Congresswoman Millicent Fenwick, but what many of you might not know is that Millicent Fenwick is a descendant of Hoboken's founding family, the Stevens family. So I hope you'll join us for that. This lecture series has been generously supported by the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, which is why we are able to offer them for free. We also receive a general operating support grant from the New Jersey Historical Commission. And I'd just like to point out that the money for these grants comes from the New Jersey taxpayer. So these lectures are an example of your tax dollars at work. Let's move on to today's event. Our author is Janet Wallach, and she is going to look at the work, life, and business philosophy of the, I think, misunderstood Hetty Green. Janet is the author of many books. She's written extensively on Middle Eastern affairs, as well as biographies on Coco Chanel, Yasser Arafat, and her book, Desert Queen, The Extraordinary Life of Gertrude Bell, was used by PBS, and they based the documentary Letters from Baghdad on it. So Janet, welcome. Let's give a virtual museum welcome to Janet Wallach. Janet, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, everybody who's joining us today. Like many biographers, I'm always interested in finding new subjects. And with that in mind, a friend of mine had mentioned Hetty Green, and I never heard of her. Who is she? What is she? I asked, and my friend said, well, she's this woman who was smart and eccentric and was known as the Witch of Wall Street in the 19th century. She was born in 1834, and her wealth was on a par with Vanderbilt, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and Rockefeller. Now, my fields have been fashion and foreign affairs, never finance, never investments. And so I really didn't know very much about the area, and I didn't know very much about Hetty. So I started reading, and I discovered that she was a female financial genius before women could even vote. And her investments made markets move. I was reading about the economic ups and downs of her times in 1857, in 1873, in 1893, in 1907. And then 100 years later, the market crashed here. And I thought, wait a minute, this book could be very relevant. And I think indeed that it is. Her story is as important now as it was then. So I read more about her. She was always in the newspapers, constantly in the newspapers. But I was looking for, like every biographer, I was looking for diaries, for journals, for letters, and I couldn't find a thing. And then I came across something that the actress Tallulah Bankhead said, which was, good girls keep diaries, bad girls don't have time. And I thought, okay, Hetty didn't have time. Not that she was busy with men, she was busy making money. Money was her passion, and it was her family's passion too. And if we take a look at the slides, I think we'll get some idea of what her family was like. Hetty Howland Robinson was born, as I said, in 1834 to a Quaker family in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Her father was Edward Robinson. Her mother was Abby Howland. And her father and her mother's father, Gideon Howland, were partners in business, and their business was whaling. Huge industry at the time, an important, vital industry, in fact, at the time, and whaling made New Bedford, Massachusetts rich. It was the richest town in America. Whales provided light for homes and factories. Whales provided the stays for corsets, the keys for pianos, the ribs for umbrellas, the whips for buggies, the fragrance for perfume, and much, much more. Whale goods were important not just in America, but in Europe as well. And New Bedford's whaling ships brought in the whales, and those same ships sent those products around the world. The Howland Robinson Company owned more whaling ships than anyone else in town. And maybe we can look at her father again. Everyone in town had some kind of investment in each whaling fleet that went out to sea. And the Howlands and the Robinsons' personal wealth ranked near the top of the town. Hetty would be an heiress to that fortune. Or would she? The family seemed to embody American values and Quaker values. They were upstanding citizens, they were hardworking, they were spiritual, and they were rich. Edward Robinson had New England values of thrift to the point of stinginess. In town, they said that he'd squeeze a coin until the eagle squealed. Edward Robinson pursued money the way Ahab pursued the whale. He was a Quaker, and Quakers believed that wealth was a sign of virtue. Wealth was a sign of God's love. Edward and his wife Abby felt very blessed by God, and they felt even more blessed when Abby found that she was with child. Naturally, Edward dreamed of a son. He would take him down to the wharfs. He would show him the whaling ships. He would teach him about the business. And when the baby arrived, they were stunned. It was a girl, Hetty. Edward was furious. He was so angry that Abby hid in her room. But her husband was determined to have a son, and 2 years later, Abby delivered a boy. But sadly, the baby died a few months later. Edward went on a rampage, so much so that Abby hid in her room. And 2-year-old Hetty was cast aside like the biblical Ishmael. She was sent away. And she was sent to her grandfather Gideon's house to live with him and her spinster aunt Sylvia, which would have been lovely, except that her grandfather was a tippler and Aunt Sylvia was sickly. Her mother was incapacitated and her father cared only about money. This little girl needed love, like most children. She was hungry for affection, and she realized that in her family, money equaled love. And so the only way to get love would be to learn about money. Luckily, she had learned to read at an early age, and when her grandfather came home from work each evening, he would snap open the papers and ask Hetty to read to him. And she read the business news, the stock trading, the commodity news, everything that was important for the business of whaling and for the banking business, because her family was in both. And she learned from that also the value of saving. She received a weekly allowance, but she only spent some of it. The rest she tucked away. And at the age of 8, she ordered up the horse and buggy and rode into town with her little purse of coins, marched into the bank, and opened a savings account. Well, that was the greatest thing that ever happened in her family, and they loved to tell that story. They were all very proud of it. But things weren't so wonderful in her family. There was a lot of tension between her father and her Aunt Sylvia, mostly over money. Sylvia thought that Edward was spending all the money, and also over how to bring up the little girl. Edward insisted that she learn from his simple values, while Sylvia wanted her to be grand. At her father's insistence for a simple life, she was sent to a Quaker boarding school where she ate dry food and wore dull clothes and read 3 chapters of the Bible every day. She had empathy for the poor girls at school, more for the rich ones. But she was miserable there, and she returned home a few years later and attended Quaker school in New Bedford. She lived in that house that you can see, and she went to school there until she was old enough to be sent to a finishing school, which is what her aunt wanted. Her aunt wanted more for her than she had received for herself. Sylvia had been sickly. She had a spinal condition that prevented her from marriage, but she had big dreams for Hetty. And so she insisted that Hetty be sent to school in Boston. She learned to dance well, she learned to play the piano, and she became a good conversationalist. And at the age of 20 or so, it was time to make her debut in society. And thanks to her aunt, Hetty was sent to family in New York. Her maternal relatives, the Grinnells, who were a prominent family in New York's business and society. With a push from Aunt Sylvia, her father gave her $1,200 to spend on a new wardrobe. And so with her socialite aunt and cousins, she went shopping in New York. She went to the department stores, the special shops on Ladies' Mile, and she also went to concerts, and she attended great Gilded Age dinners and parties, and seemingly had a wonderful time, except that not long after she arrived and did all of this, she begged her father to come home. She was very uncomfortable in that setting. When she came home, she brought back almost all of the $1,200. She proudly told her father that she had spent $200 on dresses and invested the rest in bonds. Well, she did know how to please her father. He was delighted, but her Aunt Sylvia was decidedly disappointed. But the ploy worked. Edward took her under his wing. He taught her about business, how to make business decisions on her own. He showed her the value of talking with smart investors, learning everything possible about anything she was going to buy or sell. And she learned how to study a company or a piece of property, how to analyze its costs, how to evaluate assets, how to dig through and find the debts. Edward was always watching his money, so much so that when his wife Abby died in 1860 and Hetty was supposed to inherit the money, her father took most of the money that she had expected, invested it, and called it his own. She was beside herself. And she decided to bring the case to the family lawyer, thinking that he would be like King Solomon in his wise decision. And instead, he sided with her father. It was something that she never forgot. She had some money, but not anywhere near the kind of money she had hoped to be able to invest herself. And at the same time that Edward was watching the investments, he was also watching the whaling industry. It was 1860, and he knew that oozy black stuff had been found deep underground in Pennsylvania. He saw that what was coming, he saw what was coming in fossil fuel, and he made a major change in his life. He sold his interest in the whaling business, and he became a partner in a merchant shipping firm in New York City. He moved from New Bedford to Manhattan, and Hetty went back with him to New York and enjoyed a social life herself in the city. In fact, she was invited to a grand ball, highly anticipated ball at the Academy of Music. And it was there that she was introduced to the guest of honor. "We'd like you to meet the Prince of Wales," they said. And she said, "And I am the Princess of Wales." And of course, he laughed. That was Hetty. But it wasn't the 19-year-old prince who courted her. It was a self-made millionaire named Edward H. Green. He was over 6 feet tall, he was over 200 pounds, and he was 13 years older than Hetty. He lived overseas in Asia for most of his working life. He traded in everything from tea to opium, and he used Edward Robinson's fleet to ship some of his goods. So they knew each other in a business way. Edward Green asked permission to marry Hetty, and her father approved. The man was smart. He appreciated the value of money, and he was good to Hetty, Edward's daughter. There was only one provision that Edward Robinson made, and that was that his future son-in-law sign a prenuptial agreement. In 1865, which was quite unusual, but the agreement was that Edward and Hetty would live on the husband's money. He was not to touch Hetty's money. That was for her to invest. But shortly after their engagement, her father died. He had shown faith in her judgment in investing and in business, and naturally, she expected the money from his will. She was taken aback when he left her the equal of her future husband's wealth. It was a lot of money. It was $1 million. But there was $5 million more, which he put in a trust. And again, she was furious. She felt that she had the right to invest her own money and that her father had shown little faith in her. 2 weeks after her father died, her Aunt Sylvia died. Hetty was again the only heir. She had spent months, maybe years, getting her aunt to sign an agreement that would leave almost everything to Hetty. Instead, when they read the will, she discovered that her aunt left her half the money, but she put it in a trust. Now, Quakers believed in solving their problems within their own society, within their own group. But this was beyond the pale. And so Hetty sued. It was years of litigation. And in the end, there were 1,000 pages of testimony with the greatest experts in the country. And what the case was all about was a codicil to the will, a letter that the aunt had written and signed. And the aunt's defense, the family's defense, was that the signature was identical to that of the will. And the experts all testified about this, and the decision was made in the end. Well, I won't tell you that. But yes, a year later, Hetty lost the case. But Edward stood by her. And shortly after the lawsuit started in 1867, they were married. Their wedding was at the home of the Grinnells in New York, and then they went off on their honeymoon to England, where they actually went to live. And when they were in England, she found out that she had lost the case, but there were good things too. Hetty in 1868, Hetty had a son, also named Edward. There are lots of Edwards in this family. He was Edward Howland Robinson Green, and he was called Ned. And then 3 years later, she gave birth to a daughter, Sylvia Ann Howland Green. It was kind of odd that she named her daughter after her aunt. People wondered about that, but she said she loved her aunt. Hetty was very busy, not only taking care of the children, but also investing her money in American railroads and in greenbacks. And she boasted that in one day in London, she made $200,000, a lot of money in 1871, 1872. Her husband represented an American bank, a California bank, and his work was selling American railroad bonds to, well, the greenbacks were dollars, but it was a confusing time because the dollar was backed not by silver, but not by gold, but by silver. And the question was, what was the value of silver dollars? Edward was selling railroad bonds to a booming Europe. The European banks were loaning money at low rates, and American railroads were paying high rates. So Europeans were borrowing lots of money with cheap interest in Europe and investing it in America and receiving high rates on their bonds, to the extent that 80% of American railroads were owned by Europeans. 80%. Well, they were making so much money in Europe and in America that prices for stocks and for real estate were skyrocketing until they soared too high. Markets collapsed, margin calls went out, and people needed cash to cover their margin accounts. And there was a panic. In addition to that, scandals were happening in the United States, scandals and corruption in American railroads. A major railroad collapsed, and the bank that funded that railroad closed its doors. There were no more customers for Edward in Europe, and it was time to come home. So in 1873, in the middle of the panic, they returned to New York City. The market was crashing when Hetty marched down to Wall Street. And she told her broker she wanted to invest. The brokers were shocked. But she said her motto was she would buy when everyone was selling, and she would sell when everyone else was buying. She was climbing aboard the boat when all the passengers were jumping off, and she got off the boat when everyone else clambered back on. And she invested, and she did well. But as she invested, her husband gambled. He took big risks, so big that he even had to use her money as collateral and didn't tell her. He crossed that red line. It wouldn't have been so bad, except that the banks forced Hetty to pay up on his debts. She was livid once again, and she sent him packing. So she was now, by 1885, a woman on her own, a single mother with 2 children, working and living mostly in Brooklyn Heights and in Hoboken. And like Ishmael, she was always on the move, sometimes in Brooklyn, sometimes in Hoboken, sometimes in Bellows Falls, always changing. And you can, and always suing. So there she is, a drawing of her in court. At the time, there were constant articles, despite Hetty, constant articles about women being inferior, about women being inept with money, and women innately incapable, of investing. Well, Hetty showed them otherwise. And she spoke out in the press. She told the reporters that women as young girls should learn about money and that it was their father's job to teach them. At best, they'd be better wives. And at worst, if things were tough, they could rely on themselves if they had to. And following her own example, she taught her son and daughter as much as she could about money and about business. Her son, Ned, loved it. And at a young age, Hetty got him jobs on the railroads. He started working on the tracks when he was a young boy, and he really worked his way up, learning every aspect of the railroad business. And when he was 20 years old, Hetty sent him to Chicago. Maybe we can see a picture of Ned when he was around that age. And he learned the business in Chicago. And not only did he learn the railroad business, but he also learned the real estate business there. He liked it so much, and he did so well, that the next thing Hetty did was send him to Texas, where she bought him a small branch railroad line. And Ned, over the years, turned it into the most successful small railroad in the state. Well, as much as Ned loved being in business and loved the railroads and loved making money, Sylvia hated it. She hated dragging around with her mother. She hated sitting in on business meetings that Hetty took her to. She hated numbers. She only wanted to be in Bellows Falls with her friends. Hetty had a friend herself whose name was Annie Leary. And oddly enough, Annie was a socialite in New York. She was a philanthropist, unlike Hetty, who claimed that she didn't give money to anybody or anything because she was always worried that people are after her for her money. But Annie was a very generous woman who took Sylvia under her wing. She bought her beautiful clothes, and she took her to important dinners and to parties and to concerts, even to the Patriarch's Ball, which was the great bachelor ball in New York City every year. Well, Sylvia may have had the right clothes and known what to do, but she just hated it. She said she would never go to another one of those again. But Annie Leary didn't give up. She took Sylvia to Newport. She introduced her to eligible bachelors. And Sylvia even met a couple of young men who were very interested in her. But when her mother heard about them, she turned them down. They were not good enough for Sylvia. She said she didn't know a thing about their work. They didn't work. All they wanted to do was spend money. She'd rather have Sylvia marry a poor fellow who worked hard. This was not a happy time for poor Sylvia. But Hetty was busy. Hetty was busy making money. And over the years, as the country had its booms and its busts, she just kept increasing her fortune. In 1873, in 1893, in 1907, Hetty just kept making money. And each time that the market boomed, experts say, this is different. This is a boom unlike any other. Nothing will happen. There won't be a crash this time. Nothing can happen here. Don't worry about it. And each time in the boom, people were gleeful. They became drunk on money as the markets went up. And then they were shocked when the markets collapsed. And each time they were done in by greed and by ego, by overlending and by overspending. But Hetty was always prepared. She lived a simple life. She watched her money. She kept cash on hand. She knew her companies, and she kept a cool head. She watched the madness of crowds, and she always went her own way. So while others lived lavishly in the Gilded Age, Hetty lived simply. Only one exception was when Annie Leary introduced Sylvia to a young man. Actually, they had known each other. They knew each other for quite a long time. And at one point, this young man asked, not so young, he was in his 50s, he asked Sylvia to marry him. Well, his name was Matthew Astor Wilkes. He was a distant cousin of the Astor family. And this time, Annie Leary told Hetty that she had to make it comfortable for her daughter, for Sylvia to marry Matthew. And so Hetty transformed herself from living in a boarding house. She took a suite at the Plaza Hotel. From her plain clothing, she went out and bought beautiful clothes. She took her jewelry out of the vault. She went and had a series of facials, and she became a new woman, glamorous enough for her daughter, for Annie, and for Matthew Astor Wilkes. And so her daughter was married, which made a big difference for Sylvia. And it also made a big difference for Hetty. She had a hard time with her daughter away from her after so many years. But she just kept on going in her business. And like Warren Buffett, she really lived to enjoy that money just by making the money. That was her favorite thing. And her favorite companion was now her dog. She loved that dog. And when somebody asked her why, she said, because he doesn't know how rich I am. He doesn't care about my money, which was important because she felt that everybody else was only after her money. She was in many ways like Warren Buffett. She was a female version of him, or we should say he's a male version of what Hetty Green was back then. And by the time that she died in 1916, she owned mortgages on 28 churches in Chicago. She had houses and huge office buildings and mines from Vermont to New York and from Illinois to Chicago. When times were bad in Texas and New York, she loaned those states and cities there large amounts of money, so big that she was the largest municipal bond investor in New York. And she won high praise from the city controller, who thought the world of her. She loved her children, she loved her friends, and she loved her dog. But she was wary of a lot of people who she knew were after her money. And she lived her life as she deemed best. She forged a path for women to invest, to have business careers and be mothers. And through shrewd investing, she showed that women were more than the equal of men. When she died in 1916, she left $100 million. That's not bad even now. It's more than $2 billion in money today. And at her death, newspapers around the world proclaimed her the Queen of Wall Street. And they recognized that by her own doing, she became the richest woman in America. And I think some of her words of wisdom are kind of interesting, fun to hear. She said that common sense is your greatest asset. When everyone is buying, it's time to sell. When everyone is selling, it's time to buy. And remember, never close a deal until you've slept on it overnight. So I hope you all sleep well tonight, and I hope you all make good deals tomorrow. And I thank you for listening in. And how much did the dog get? I do not know the answer to that question.
She didn't do the Leona Helmsley. She had common sense. She had common sense, so she wouldn't have done that. We can take a few questions for Jen. I don't know if there's any over at our Zoom talk. By the way, we've got about 32 people here in our room. Somebody asked what a greenback was, but that's just another term for a dollar. Yes, right. A greenback. I want to go back to the slides because there's one slide in particular I'd like us to take a look at because it's kind of funny. Whoops. It's a slide we haven't talked about. It's this one. This is from the Puck magazine of 18, and I guess this is when millionaires had to start paying their taxes?
Yes, and what Hetty did, actually, yes, she did everything she possibly could to avoid taxes. And in fact, she was living in Brooklyn Heights. And in 1898, Brooklyn was incorporated into the new city of New York. And that's when Hetty moved permanently or semi-permanently to Hoboken, because then again, she would not have to pay taxes. I think it's fun that you don't see it as much in that picture, but there was a lot of similarity between Brooklyn and Hoboken.
Yeah.
They were both on the water. They both had lovely row houses, and they had lots of trees and leaves and parks. And as I said, they were on the water. It was an easy ferry ride from both places to Wall Street. And in Hoboken, she lived in an apartment or in a boarding house. She really didn't stay for long periods of time anywhere because she was worried that people would find her and ask her for money. And so she was constantly on the move, and she would use aliases, other names, so that people wouldn't find her. But she did like Hoboken. In fact, she loved living there. Her other favorite place to live was Bellows Falls, which was the home of Edward Green. That was where he grew up. That's where his family was from. And she was very comfortable there. Not comfortable in New Bedford, where she had done everything she could to get her family money, particularly her aunt's money. And her Aunt Sylvia had left a large part of it to New Bedford. And when Hetty started fighting that, New Bedford really was angry at her. And so she almost never went back there. Only once, I think, that she talked about.
And so what happened to Hetty's money? Did she
Well,
leave it to Sylvia and Ned?
It went to her children, to Sylvia and Ned, but neither one of them had children. And so then it was dispersed. After they died, it went to, a lot of it went to the family, but it went in, and they gave some to charity. And by the way, Hetty did give money to charity over the years. She did it anonymously, or she would do it in other names, but she did give money. And then her children gave some of that money away, and a lot of it went to the family. And as I have spoken around the country, I have actually met people who inherited very small bits and pieces of her estate. So it's kind of interesting. There were many, many relatives. Yeah. But it kind of disappeared.
We have a question from Sam Reckford, who's a member of the Stevens family. He asks, didn't she have a house at the corner of 2nd and Washington? Did she own a house in? You probably would have rented it. I've never heard that, actually. Yeah, no. Did Hetty and Edward get divorced, or they stay married?
They stayed married, and in fact, after a while, her daughter really they always kept contact, kept in contact, and they would have lunch together once in a while down on Wall Street. And then at one point, her daughter really pushed her and got them together again. So they lived in separate apartments, but in the same houses. And they did stay married, and they did actually stay as friends. She was very fond of him, and he was very fond of her. And I think they really, despite his risky investments, I won't call them investments, his risky actions, he was smart, he was charming, he was good to be with, and so she really enjoyed his company. And he was the father of their children. Yeah.
We have another question here from Suzanne Preston. She is asking about Ned's leg. This is a story that many of us know. Yeah.
Yes. When Ned was a young boy, he was in a sledding accident and hurt his leg. And I think then a year or two later, he fell from a tree, climbing a tree. And it was, the leg was so badly damaged. Hetty tried every way to help him. First on her own, using, I guess you would say, homeopathic methods. And then she took him to doctors. She and Edward took him to a number of doctors. Every one of them recommended amputating his leg. And she was absolutely against it, 100%. And then she took him to New York. She took him to Baltimore, I think, to Johns Hopkins, everywhere, and came up with this. It was always the same. And she refused to do it. So he walked with a limp. When he was in his 20s, I think, he was hit by a truck in New York. And at that point, he was taken to the hospital, and the doctors had no choice, but they had to amputate. And that's how he lost his leg. And they gave him a wooden leg, and he walked with that. But he enjoyed life to the hilt. That didn't stop him from anything, from going out with chorus girls, from actually one of those girls became his serious, intimate friend, and moved with him to Texas, and couldn't marry him for 20 years because that's what Hetty said. He could not marry anybody for 20 years. But after Hetty died, they did marry, and Mabel Harlow, who Hetty called Mabel Harlot, became his wife.
We've just had a clarification. Someone asked did Hetty own a house at 2nd and Washington, and Suzanne Preston has just on the chat window here, she's noted that it was actually John Jacob Astor who had a house at 2nd and Washington. So we have our Gilded Age millionaires a little mixed up there. So thanks for that clarification, Suzanne. Someone is asking what, we talked about who got her money that got dispersed among a large group of extended family members. And Hetty did eventually receive her father's money. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, was her husband a gambler?
I said again, he gambled. He took great risks when he invested.
I see. So it was gambling on investments.
Yes. Because she was a serious investor. She held her positions for long periods of time. She knew those businesses inside and out, and she was not a trader. He was more a trader and a risk taker. Yes.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. So let's see. Wait. Let's see. I believe that part of her estate directly or indirectly went to some women's colleges, Smith or Wellesley.
It went to, yes. Ned had good friends whose daughters went to Wellesley. And so he gave some of that money to Wellesley. And there was actually a Hetty Green Hall for a long time there, up until not that long ago.
I never knew that.
Yeah.
Okay. Someone's asking about the slides that we showed. Let me just go back here for 1 second. Let me just say, this is the apartments at the Yellow Flats, they're known as, or Legion's apartments. These are at 12th and Washington. Hetty was known to live in this building, yes. And she lived here for a while, then she moved out. When she wanted to move back, she wanted to move back into the apartment she lived in. That wasn't available. So apparently she went and lived around the corner on Bloomfield Street.
Yes.
So this is the only slide I had that showed, that area around that time. So she would have lived up on about between 11th and 12th, I'm guessing, on Bloomfield. and stuff.
Yes.
There. I believe someone found a mortgage. Really, Terry Francis is saying he believes that someone on the 600 block of Hudson Street found a mortgage paper that showed Hetty as the holder of the mortgage, but not the resident. Well, that would kind of make sense.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that she owned property here.
Yes.
That she probably rented out. It'd be
Yes.
interesting to find out just how much property she owned in Hoboken. Boy, if she had held on to that, Jen, she'd really be rich today. Okay, I just want to let everybody know that we're going to, Janet, I want to thank you so much for today. And Janet is going to join us next week. And let me put up the information about that. Janet will be coming back. We'll do a deeper dive into the book. And we'll also do a deeper dive into how you came to write the book, Janet, how, you know, how your research went, maybe some of your other biographies, and a little deeper look into Hetty's kind of psychology, maybe a little bit. And so I hope that everyone will join us for that. Again, we thank the New Jersey Council on the Humanities for all their support. And we hope that everyone will join us next week for the book talk. And of course, the Amy Shapiro talk on Millicent Fenwick, and that's October 18th at 4 p.m.